Hello, and welcome to a supplemental episode for Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Ahrens, and today I'm going to talk about a very controversial topic. After much deliberation and much deep thought, I came to the conclusion that it was necessary to address this, as those of us alive now are the last generation to have known pianos that, by the majority, had ivory on their keys. Before I go any further, it is a necessary and responsible step for me to declare freely and openly that I agree fully with the international ivory ban, and that, in my view, no elephant should be killed for its tusks ever again. Now, with that being said, this supplemental comes from a question I've had asked before from younger pianists regarding ivory. Why was it used? What benefit could it possibly have? And why is there a persistent feeling of nostalgia for a material that has been easily replaced in modern times by more durable and more affordable plastic? First, let's consider how it was used. Ivory as a natural substance is very easy to carve with precision, and for centuries it was used for figurines and decorations, and also inlays in wooden boxes and furniture. Instruments from centuries ago had keyboards made of just about anything. They were not necessarily white and black, nor were the light-colored keys necessarily the larger ones. You could find keyboards of boxwood, rosewood, mother of pearl, bone, and even tortoiseshell was used as a key topping. Also, they could be decorated quite heavily. There are surviving virginals with keys inlaid with different semi-precious stones, and harpsichords and fortepianos with complex inlays that mimic a skunk's tail. There is very little documentation regarding why keyboards developed to become the way they are now in terms of the color scheme, but it's pretty clear that as keyboard instruments developed, and their music along with it, more complex performances were required, and the person playing the instrument would simply have a better chance of seeing the different notes if sharps and naturals were differentiated heavily in color. White and black contrast heavily, and both colors can be stained or found in natural materials, so an obvious development took place. If the naturals are white, the sharps are black, and vice versa. Ivory has always been more expensive as a material than woods like ebony, and thus instruments that were less expensive happened to have what we refer to now as reverse color keyboards, where the sharps were white with ivory, and the naturals were black with ebony, thus saving on the precious material. This free-for-all regarding keyboard color was to eventually disappear in the early 1800s, though there is no documented reason or start date. I have to hypothesize here. Out of the two colors, white tends to show the dark gaps between notes better than black. Naturally, if you are looking at a keyboard by candlelight, one with white naturals and black sharps is far easier to see and control. Furthermore, piano manufacturers began to standardize the keyboard's size itself. Before this time, you could find key widths that differed depending on the maker. And this is very disconcerting if you're a pianist used to the standard size on every piano today. Stretching for an octave would change depending on the instrument being used. You can only imagine how your precision would disappear entirely if you played a Chopin etude on a piano with a keyboard slightly smaller or larger. So, in the end, you have keyboards being standardized in terms of size, and naturally in terms of color. I can guess, given how humans can be, that performers who toured the European continent at the time would have asked for this kind of standardization of the piano makers as well. It affords advantages to everyone, and if the pianists play better, then that's better advertising for the piano makers as well, because their instruments sound great too. But this really is just another way of saying that the overall concept of keyboards shifted from being highly decorated and ornate buttons to practical implements that should be extensions of the pianist. This is where ivory comes to the forefront. Being a rather hard material, ivory can withstand impacts without splintering, as wood will do on occasion. Pianists in the 1800s were using more and more force as the years went by, and as pianos were built to project more and more sound. In some ways, again, we could hypothesize that ivory was used because it was the hardest white material that they had available to them. It would not shatter as easily as bone, which was the only other white alternative used in keyboards. And as a bonus, it was a luxurious item, which the maker could use to inflate the perceived value of the instrument. What they may or may not have known at the time is that ivory also, due to its nature, has properties that are heavily advantageous to pianists. It is quite common amongst pianists that when they perform, they sweat. When we play on wooden keys, the sweat is absorbed by the wood to some small degree, and given the texture of the wood grain, there is a natural grip that we can feel due to the minuscule uneven surface of the wood. It allows us to use the surface of the key as a secondary anchor for complex movements around the keyboard. Ivory has the same property. It will wick sweat away from the surface, and the grain of the ivory will provide a natural grip. When we sweat while playing on an ivory keyboard, we don't slip off the keys. And yet, the grip is not a sticky grip, one that will impede movement. It's simply a matter of not too much, not too little, but just right. This practical advantage is perhaps the only advantage ivory has as a keyboard topping. There are problems with ivory, as there are with any other organic material. Though ivory does not tend to splinter with hard use, it can, in rare circumstances, shatter, and that can lead to injury. Ivory wears down with time and use, and this creates very sharp edges on the keyboard, which have the ability to draw blood. Ivory, when new, can be beautiful to the eye, but with heavy use and old age, ivory gets yellowish like decaying teeth. It is a material that requires attention, care, and sometimes maintenance, depending on how old the instrument is. For the modern pianist, ivory is simply archaic when we consider the materials we have at our disposal. But this brings us to the most difficult but necessary aspect to address if we're going to have an honest conversation about this controversial material. Why is there a nostalgic love for ivory? Why does it have an almost romantic feeling attached to it? Why is it possible, as some of you may have experienced, to encounter an older pianist who wistfully remembers the pleasure of playing on ivory while simultaneously reaffirming their heartfelt objection to the killing of elephants? It all has to do with feeling, and by this I mean the sense of touch. In addition to the sweat-wicking properties that ivory affords, it also has a very interesting feel to it. The scientific term related to this is thermal conductivity. Essentially, this is the ability for a material to conduct heat. Materials that have a high thermal conductivity, like copper, will transfer heat more efficiently than materials of low thermal conductivity, like polystyrene. Our human experience of thermal conductivity revolves around how a material feels to us. If we touch room temperature copper, it'll feel cold as it draws away the heat efficiently from our fingers. But if we touch room temperature polystyrene, it feels about room temperature, if not a little warmer, because the temperature transfer is very slow and inefficient. Ivory has a low thermal conductivity, and because of this, you get the impression that it can feel warm to the touch, depending on your own blood flow to the fingers. Ivory doesn't feel cold and then suddenly warmer, the way that plastics on keyboards can. And it also feels like it transfers vibrations of the instrument far more efficiently than plastics. Our human experience tells us that we are feeling an organic material at our fingertips, one that can be emotionally felt as an extension of our body rather than the cold, inhuman impression we get from plastics. It's similar to the feelings people get from reading a physical book, turning paper pages, compared with reading a book on a digital screen, pressing a button to go to the next page. The end result is almost the same, but the experience of it is radically different. This is ultimately what it's all about, the experience. Humans value the experience of something, and if the experience is pleasurable, then they simply want more of it. Replacements for ivory have, for the most part, failed miserably to replicate the experience due to many factors. The use of plastics on keyboards started in the 1950s, initially because of ivory stocks becoming more limited, and because plastics were cheaper and more durable in the long run. They wouldn't yellow with age, they wouldn't shatter, and they needed little to no maintenance. But they didn't replicate the texture, the sweat wicking properties, the thermal conductivity levels, or the ability to transfer vibrations. Plastic, when wet, becomes as slippery as ice, and if you've ever played on a 1960s plastic keyboard when sweating, you'll understand why it is a hazard, not only to your own technique, but to your own sanity as well. There have been efforts by some of the major piano companies to develop ivory substitutes, but to this day I have yet to play on a material that does everything we need it to do. This is the challenge that I would pose to any manufacturer looking to replicate this material. First and foremost, we need the material to be porous enough to wick sweat away from the fingers, yet feel as dense as ivory. Second, we need a material that has a texture to it, like a wood grain, that allows us to feel the keys and use them as secondary anchors in difficult technical displays. Third, we need the thermal conductivity to be the same as ivory, where it's low enough that it never feels too cold to the touch, and it never heats up during performance. Finally, ivory's capability of transferring vibrations from the keyboard to the fingertips must be replicated as well. It's not impossible to get the precise measurements of these attributes of ivory. The difficulty is in replicating them with artificial materials. It is the combination of all of these attributes that will satisfy the pianist on the practical level as well as the aesthetic and human levels. Bottom line, we can't use ivory ever again. But technology and scientific understanding continue to develop at an accelerated rate, and I have no doubt that a company will eventually find a substitute that has all of these attributes. That is the challenge, and when they do find it, I think there will be widespread acceptance and enthusiastic support amongst the pianist community. Until then, however, there will always be a dangerous, wistful remembrance for a material that was cultivated by the killing of remarkable animals. In order to truly destroy this harmful desire for ivory that still takes hold in parts of the world today, we must find a substitute that does exactly the same job. Not partially, exactly. So, that's it for this supplemental for Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep on making music, and please talk with your local piano manufacturers about this issue. Find out if they're working on it, and gently remind them that this problem has not yet been solved in full. Bye for now.